We're thrilled to be hosting Mark Bray, who, in addition to being the author of this book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, has been an organizer of Occupy Wall Street, a lecturer at Dartmouth. We might hear more about that later. And also has written other books and articles for many, many online publications, print publications, what have you. So we've all seen the news lately. We know why this book is relevant, and we've also been hearing this word, Antifa, used in a variety of ways, maybe positive, maybe very, very negative. So that's why we are here tonight, to hear what Mark Bray has to say. He has talked with many people of the movement. He has researched the history of the movement, both in the 30s and 40s and throughout the decades since, and he's going to give us a lot of perspective on where we are today with it. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Mark Bray to Politics and Prose.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. So thank you to Politics and Prose for having me. Thank you all for coming out. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this book is, what it is not. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, talk a little bit about some of the historically informed foundation of anti-fascist politics, and then we'll open up for a conversation. All right? So the book is an attempt to do a couple of different things. It's an attempt to explain to the general society what anti-fascism is now, what it's been historically. It's an effort to provide a broader context for those struggling against fascism and racism today. It's based on 61 interviews with current and former anti-fascists from 17 different countries in Europe and North America. The goal was to bring this wider context, which a lot of people maybe don't know about. I myself do not have experience doing anti-fascist organizing, though I hate fascism as much as the next person. So the purpose of this is to bring to bear the insights and experiences of people who have done this work, many of whom are not able to necessarily share that insight publicly. We'll discuss why later. So when we talk about anti-fascism, it's useful to be clear about what we're talking about. A lot of times historians, when they talk about anti-fascism in the 30s and 40s, will describe as anti-fascist just about anyone who fought against Hitler and Mussolini, even if in some cases those people were also fascists, right? So the purpose of this book is to focus on one specific tradition within anti-fascism, which in English and Italian is referred to as militant anti-fascism, in German is sometimes called autonomous anti-fascism, and in French is sometimes called radical anti-fascism. And this tendency exists at the intersection of two main considerations. The first is it's a pan-radical left politics. Anti-fascists are socialists, they are anarchists, they are communists and other kinds of leftists. And so militant anti-fascism is a proposal for left folks to put aside all of the differences that cause so many arguments when it comes to fighting the common enemy of fascism. And part of that is motivated from the failure of many leftists in Europe in the 20s and 30s to do that, or at least to do it early enough before it was too late. The other consideration is direct action strategy and tactics. So I'll get into why that's important later. But the two main considerations to reiterate are pan-radical left politics and direct action strategy and tactics. Therefore, you have militant anti-fascism. So the Antifa groups that we see in the news today they come out of that tradition. Okay? We'll talk more about where that tradition came from in a little bit. But I'm going to read an excerpt from the book so you can get a little better sense of what it would be like if you acquired a copy. Just putting that out there. All right, so this is from the beginning of chapter 2. The book is organized into 3 history chapters and then a few politics chapters. The image of British Member of Parliament Mavis Tate flickers onto the screen. I, as a Member of Parliament, visited Buchenwald concentration camp with 9 others, she opens. Some people believe that the reports of what happened there are exaggerated. Cut to stacks of bodies in the back of a truck. No words could exaggerate, Tate clarifies. We saw and we know. A man attempts to shovel charred skeletons from industrial ovens. The reality was indescribably worse than the pictures. Finally, she concludes, "Let no one say these things were never real." When the projection stopped in this small theater in northwest London in 1945, Morris Beckman and his cousin Harry Rose filed out into the lobby. Newsreels such as these showed the world a sliver of Nazi terror, but it wasn't really until the 1970s that the Holocaust began to be perceived by both scholars and the general public as an historical event of major importance. But for Jews like Beckman and Rose, however, the horror could not be more palpable. They knew what post-war newsreels did not say, that most of the twisted corpses on the screen had belonged to adoring Jewish daughters, lovingly eccentric Jewish fathers, tough as nails Jewish grandmothers who gave a wry smile every time they recounted surviving the pogroms of their youth. Beckman and Rose did not need to hear that from Mavis Tate. They were all too aware. They felt sick seeing those bodies like skeletons covered with skin. Both had served in the war, Beckman as a radio operator in the Merchant Marine, and Rose in a unit that had fought behind enemy lines in Burma. As Jewish veterans, Nazism could not have been more personal. And so, as they walked home from the theater on that day, they could not have been more appalled by what they came upon. On a platform nearby, they saw a former 18B detainee, and in Britain, the 18B detainees were people who had been imprisoned during the war for Nazi sympathies. So they came across an 18B detainee shouting, "Not enough Jews were burned at Belsen. Not enough Jews were burned at Belsen." "I can't believe it," Rose exclaimed. Still wearing his uniform and medals, he went up to a nearby police officer to complain, but the cop just shrugged and walked away. "Well, I'll get the bastard," Rose said, but Beckman held him back, fearing arrest. "But isn't anybody going to do something about this?" Rose exclaimed. Over the next few years, the approximately 14 fascistic groups in London organized a campaign against the Jewish population of the country. They put up posters with slogans like "Jews must go" and "War on the Jews." They attacked people in Jewish neighborhoods. They attempted to burn down synagogues, and they even threw a bomb into a union meeting. Not long after holding back his cousin from attacking a fascist speaker, Morris Beckman and 3 fellow Jewish veterans came upon another outdoor meeting of fascists, this time organized by the British League of Ex-Servicemen and Women. That day, Geoffrey Ham, formerly of the British Union of Fascists from the 1930s, was denouncing the, quote, "aliens in our midst," while our boys fought overseas. The Jewish veterans listening to this had had enough. This group of 4, which included a judo expert formerly of the Welsh Guards, a former Royal Air Force pilot, Beckman, and another veteran, spread out into the crowd of 60. As the judo expert pretended to be buying the newspaper the fascists were selling, he suddenly smashed together the heads of the 2 fascist guards while Beckman and the others toppled the stage, dispersing everyone. Beckman explained that the sheer malevolence of the speaker moved him and his comrades to physically shut down a post-war fascist meeting for the first time. It would not be the last time. This direct action sparked the formation in March 1946 of the 43 Group, a militant anti-fascist organization composed mainly, though not entirely, of Jewish British veterans dedicated to shutting down fascism through direct action and pursuing legislation against racist incitement. The 43 Group commando units had several methods to shut down fascist meetings. If a single member could get through the cordon of fascist stewards guarding the stage to topple over the platform, the police had a policy of not allowing the fascists to set it up again. So, with that in mind, the group organized units of about a dozen into a wedge formation. They would start far back out into the crowd and at an agreed-upon time build up steam so that they could plow through many times their number of muscular fascists to topple the stage. If the platform was too well guarded, and after a while the fascists figured out this tactic, so if it was too well guarded, the commandos did have a plan B. They would, instead of charging the stage, they would disperse out into the crowd and start arguments and fights with fascists so that the chaos forced the police to shut down the event. Another method was to, quote, jump the pitch by occupying the fascist meeting space well before the fascist event could start. So between all these methods, By the summer of 1946, the 43 group was attacking 6 to 10 fascist meetings per week. As an aside, let's take note of the fact that there were 6 to 10 fascist meetings per week in London in 1946. Beckman estimates that about a third were disrupted by the 43 group, about a third were ended by the police, and another third continued as planned. After a while, the 43 group became so popular that locals would even join them or shut down fascist meetings on their own using similar tactics. With the emergence of the, quote, fucking hard-cased East End Yids, as the black shirts called them, I love that line, the keep your head down and get indoors quick mentality had gone for good. So what can we learn from the example of the 43 group in post-war London? Well, I think there's a few things that help us understand where anti-fascists are coming from. So to start, we can see that even one small fascism can be dangerous and deadly. So take this case. It's after World War II. If you read historians of post-war Britain, when they talk about the role of fascism in the late 40s in Britain, they'll say, yeah, okay, there were still some groups that were kind of, enamored with Hitler or whatever, but they were marginal, didn't really matter, didn't influence British politics, nothing to see here, move on. But if you were a Jewish person in the East End of London who was afraid to walk out your front door, or who had your synagogue, almost burnt down, then this was a deadly serious issue. Right? And so the question cannot be an all or nothing question where either you have a fascist regime or you don't pay attention. Even in small doses, fascism can be dangerous and deadly. We've seen that recently with murders by fascists in Oregon, in Maryland, in Charlottesville, and elsewhere. So even in small doses, fascism can be dangerous. Even when we think of it in terms of regimes, we can see that Mussolini's initial fascist nucleus in 1919 was only 100 men. 2 years later, it was 250,000. When Hitler attended his first meeting of the German Workers' Party, before he turned it into the Nazi Party, it had 54 members. Now, sometimes these groups don't grow big, right? But sometimes they do. And so it's worth shutting them down before they have the opportunity. And this is not just a historical phenomenon. I mean, more recently in Greece, we can see that the fascist Golden Dawn was a micro-party for many years, not worthy of even much attention from the left relatively. And then after the financial crisis of 2008, they became the third largest party in Greece, equipped with a fascist goon squad that murdered immigrants and attacked all sorts of people. So even when small, deadly serious. What else can it show us? It can show us that militant anti-fascist methods can work. So the 43 group formed in 1946 with a very specific mission of stopping the campaign of terror against the Jewish population. They voluntarily disbanded in 1949, considering their task to have been largely accomplished. Now, unfortunately, that was not the end of the story of British fascism. It re-emerged in different forms over the coming decades, but at least in the short term, they were successful in thwarting this threat. And there are many other examples that I document in my book of militant anti-fascism stopping fascist, white supremacist, and Nazi formations before they can get off the ground. A lot of the debate in the news over whether these kinds of tactics or methods are effective, the discussion happens in the abstract. It's as if anti-fascism is a new proposition being put forward by these crazy kids in black, and clearly, that doesn't make any sense. But there's a whole history of it that goes back a century that we can look at, and in its modern form goes back several decades. We can see that the way that fascist movements grow is not all that different from how left movements grow. They need to establish bases in communities. They need to provide services. They need to propagate their ideas. They need to become normalized. Their ideas need to become common sense and accepted by the population. That's how fascist movements grow, right? We can see that in Italy, when the fascist Casa Pound hands out free food to ethnic Italians only, that is a response to certain financial, economic problems, and it ties into a certain nativist, racist, xenophobic, nationalist sentiment. So how do you stop fascism from growing? Well, you stop them from doing the kinds of things that movements need to grow. This is often more self-evident for people who have been involved in social movements who realize, it's awfully difficult to get people to follow through on tasks in your group. It's awfully difficult to get people to care about what you're talking about. But if you have a group of dedicated activists trying to stop you at every step of the way, it's that much harder. This seems to somewhat almost self-evident to a lot of people who have put the time into this work, but for pundits it's not. What else can we learn from the 43 group? Well, we can see that resistance can be contagious. We can see that after a while, the model put forward by the 43 group was picked up by other people who were under attack. And I think that shows that when anti-fascism is working, it transcends being a specialist activity and becomes a self-evident mode of community self-defense. And another point to make is that it shows that sometimes groups who are under attack, vulnerable groups, cannot trust the majority population to look out for their interests, right? Unfortunately, that is in some senses one of the tragic lessons of genocide, more broadly speaking, right? Is that when we look at, so to take a step back, if we discuss social movement strategies and tactics, one way of looking at how social movements should operate is to say, okay, what is the most popular opinion in society about what politics should look like, right? You assess that opinion and you try to gear your strategy and tactics to that opinion. But what anti-fascism does that I think that complicates the picture a little is it says, no, we should start by defending vulnerable communities who are under attack, who do not have the support of the majority. Because we could see in this case, or even in the case of the Battle of Cable Street of 1936, when the anti-Semitic British Union of Fascists proposed to march through the Jewish East End of London and were stopped by over 100,000 anti-fascists, that if those anti-fascists had listened to the majority public opinion, they would not have blocked that march. When those fascists were stopped, they complained, this anti-fascist blockade is disrupting our freedom of speech. Our freedom of speech entails being able to hurl anti-Semitic slurs to this Jewish population as a genocide is underway in continental Europe, right? So to sum up briefly, I think anti-fascism reverses the order of explanation in social movement politics by saying, start by defending vulnerable communities, empowering communities to self-manage and defend themselves, and then work out towards building larger social movements. Don't start with the perspectives of people who don't have any skin in the game. A few more thoughts before we move on. Militant anti-fascism is a critique of the liberal, classically liberal, not necessarily strictly in an American sense, but the classically liberal prescription for fighting fascism. So what is that prescription? I think it entails three things. One is faith in reasoned debate and argumentation to defeat fascist ideas, right? Now, that's not to say that anti-fascists don't make arguments. They sure make a hell of a lot of arguments, and they should. And so should the left. But in the 20s and 30s and 40s, arguments were not enough. They weren't. So we can't assume that they're going to be enough now, right? And we can also see that there is a failure to take power seriously in the faith that arguments alone can change things without larger social struggle. Second part of it is faith in the police to stop fascists or white supremacists when they do something illegal. In the short term, we can see that they were certainly MIA in Charlottesville when clergy were there to commit acts of civil disobedience and be arrested, and instead were confronted by hundreds of armed neo-Nazis looking to maul them. Cornel West and others credited anti-fascists with saving their lives that day. But going farther back in time, we can see that apart from the fact that the police in the United States grew out of Southern slave patrols and the capitalists need to protect, the capitalist system, more specifically, we can see that the police are often the most sympathetic to the fascist promise to a quote-unquote return to law and order. They certainly were not the first ones out on the streets to fight Mussolini and Hitler, I can tell you that for damn sure. More recently, we can see in France or in Germany, the police voted for Golden Dawn or the Front National in higher percentages than the general population. So they argue you can't assume the police are going to protect you. And then finally, it's a faith in parliamentary government to stop the advance of fascism. There's this assumption that fascism is the antithesis of parliamentary government, but instead, if you look at how parliamentary governments are set up, they almost all have some sort of authoritarian escape valve built in. So Hitler and Mussolini were both appointed after their parties grew powerful. The Enabling Act that allowed Hitler to concentrate power was approved by Parliament, because parliamentary governments have safety valves for moments of quote-unquote crisis, and fascism is one way to take advantage of that for an authoritarian direction. So, to reiterate, militant anti-fascists argue that you need popular resistance, you need direct action. And part of the other reason they argue that is they are revolutionaries. They are not simply trying to stop fascism, they're also trying to build a better, more humane post-capitalist world. Now I'm going to make one more point, and then we'll open it up for, I'm sure, a lively conversation. When we think of what anti-fascism is or is not, I think definitions can be very helpful in delineating a specific tradition, but they can also be limiting, right? So in trying to think through what anti-fascism is or is not, I found it helpful to think a little bit about what fascism is. And I was struck by the description given by Ami Césaire that to some extent we can think of Nazism and fascism as European imperialism and colonialism brought home to the European continent. There's a variety of ways that you can think of that, but you know, Nazi eugenics were modeled on American eugenics. The Nazi attempt to depopulate Eastern Europe was modeled on the genocide of the indigenous population of the Americas. The Nazis weren't the first to build concentration camps. They had built by the Spanish monarchy in Cuba. You have reservations in the United States. You have them in the Boer War in Southwest Africa, built by the Germans decades earlier. So if for the sake of argument we think through fascism this way, then I think that we can also see anti-fascism in its specific form when it originated in response to Mussolini in the 1920s as one variant of a larger transnational global struggle against white supremacy, genocide, and imperialism that stretches back centuries. In that sense, anti-fascism can be seen as something specific, but it can also be seen as sort of one variant of a larger struggle. Sure, under the specific label, anti-fascism started in Europe, but it's not as if people of the Americas or Africa or Asia are any strangers to fighting against white supremacy, right? And moreover, as I specified in the beginning, the explicitly anti-fascist tradition stretches well beyond North America and Europe to influence struggles around the world. Chinese opposition to Japanese imperialism in the 40s, opposition to Latin American dictatorships in the 70s and beyond. So the other part of that is that when we think about anti-fascism, sure, there are people that are organizing against fascism today. There are people who are part of self-described anti-fascist groups. But when we think about fighting fascism, there's, I think, two parts to it. And this is what I learned from an anti-fascist from Madrid who went by the name Daniel. He said, in his opinion, there are two faces to anti-fascism. The one face is the face of trying to stop fascist groups from organizing, short-circuiting their ability to express their genocidal aspirations, to organize a mass movement, right? So one is stopping them. The other is building a society that is immune to the appeal of fascism, building a strong workers' movement, building self-sufficient communities that when they hit hard times are not going to become xenophobic and turn to the right. So in that sense, we can see that to some extent there are, as Daniel phrased it, two faces to anti-fascism. And when we think of it that way, we can see that, sure, there are people who put a lot of their time into fighting fascism, but in a broader sense, all of us who have an interest in building a better world could subscribe to the slogan put forward by the Italian anti-fascists, Siamo tutti antifascisti. We're all anti-fascists. We all have an investment in pushing back, and we should all think of it that way. So thanks, and look forward to questions and comments.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. I guess I want to say first, I wasn't familiar with you until I saw you on Democracy Now! And I guess I just first want to say thank you for your work in Occupy. But I think
Thanks.
one of my main concerns is, and it sort of picks on what you just said at the end there, I think so many people of goodwill are essentially anti-fascist.
Mm-hmm.
And that so much in terms of movement building and protecting the vulnerable, I think that has great appeal,
Mm-hmm.
including active civil disobedience, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Protecting Cornell West and
Sure.
others.
Sure.
But when folks probably maybe heard last weekend, there's a radio program called Reveal. And there was the, I'm sorry, I need to look at some notes.
Go ahead.
There was the host of that show, Al Leston, and the radio program is on WMU, the local NPR station, and is put out by the Center for Investigative Reporting. And he, I guess this was back in, I think about a month ago, in Berkeley, I believe on Sunday, August 27th, where Al Leston, an African-American man, interceded some, as he described them, 5 people dressed in black with masks on their faces, brutally beating the man to the ground. They kicked, punched, and hit him with poles while he laid there in the fetal position. And the person he was talking about was Keith Campbell, a white far-right wing activist.
Mm-hmm.
And Al Leston is an African-American man, and he literally dove, put his body in the way, and that prevented them from beating Keith Campbell pretty severely.
Yep.
I guess my question is, I understood that this Keith Campbell was really a pretty bad person, no doubt. But in terms of the movement, in terms of the public image, in terms of the possibility of escalating, so that somebody who just looks bad, who is say a democratic socialist like me, whatever, and that isn't this just going to make things look worse for the broader movement and make us and not just, hey, well, if you don't agree with it, don't do it. But no, that could be some real backlash, violent backlash against people who aren't in that way. So
Okay. Thank you for your question. Well, I don't know a whole lot about the specific circumstance of what you're talking about, but I can talk about this sort of question of optics and image and self-defense and violence and anti-fascism more broadly. So there's a range of perspectives on the left over what is or is not the right way to fight fascism, right? There always has been, there always will be. The militant anti-fascist argument is that, one, self-defense needs to be on the table. It has been proven that if you let fascists and white supremacists and Nazis organize, it's only a matter of time before the violence is manifests. But the thing that where we're going with this question, it seems, though once again I don't know that detail very well, is anti-fascists understand self-defense both in a preemptive sense and, in an immediate sense and a preemptive sense. What does it mean to advocate for preemptive self-defense? Well, it essentially means that anti-fascists are unwilling to give fascists and white supremacists the benefit of the doubt that their organizing may not result in serious violence to significant numbers of people. They argue that if you are trying to organize for a white ethno-state, if you are trying to argue that black people or Jews are inhumans, that queer or trans people should be liquidated, that is a opening salvo in what will, if left to continue, be a very violent political trend, and so they argue for stopping it in any way possible. Most of the ways that anti-fascists organize do not entail physical confrontation. They entail research, they entail doxing, they entail trying to shut down events by notifying owners of venues, contacting hotels. There's all sorts of ways they do it. But part of it is by showing up and confronting these people, and in some cases, it's by physically humiliating them. Part of it is that if you look at some of these prominent neo-Nazi leaders in Europe or Klansmen in the United States, that there has been a successful track record of making it physically costly to be a neo-Nazi leader. That is, from the anti-fascist perspective, essentially a variation on preemptive self-defense. It's saying, all right, if we look at what happened with the Holocaust and slavery and genocide of the indigenous population, not going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you trying to organize this group is not going to cost someone their life down the road. That's the argument. It's a politics that assumes the worst of these groups based on the historical record and points to the fact that when small, they may grow. Now, what are the optics of that? Because that's part of the conversation, right? Now, there's a range of opinion within the anti-fascist movement over how important public image is and movement building is. And so I don't want to mischaracterize it by leaning one way or the other. There are some that simply say, all right, as long as we stop these people, that's all that matters. I spoke to one anti-fascist from Barcelona who said, honestly, I don't care if people hate Antifa as long as we get the job done. Because when I take off my black mask, I'm a union organizer. My community loves me because I help to organize for better wages. And not all of my politics have to be in the same box. There's other forms of anti-fascism that organize through building popular networks and movements. In France, there's an assembly model where a lot of militant anti-fascists have their affinity groups, but also help to create neighborhood assemblies that build through the labor movement, that build through community organizing and political parties. There's a range of perspectives. Certainly not everyone is going to be on board with everything that we're talking about, but I think the sort of lesson of anti-fascism is to think about how we can all push in the same direction and recognize that if we get lost in the conversation over which forms of self-defense are legitimate, there's going to become a time when we're going to get divided. And in the 1930s, there were people who were urging caution and saying, we should not go physically confront the Nazis, we should focus on electoral strategies and stay within the legality of parliamentary politics. That was a mistake. Now, is today the 1930s in Germany? I don't think so, but that doesn't mean that we should consider that the lesson is not applicable. These are the politics. I hope that at least gives some insight. Yes.
Actually, my question is going to follow up with your very last
that's
statement.
great.
But before it, I'd like to say a couple of things. One, it's a good idea to pass out literature sometimes when you do it to explain what's going on, possibly. Two, I think what you're really talking about, or the way I'm interpreting it, is isolation, discrimination, politics. It's a political view of taking a group of people and putting them down completely, and then attacking them and keeping them out of the system.
Sure.
Okay, here's the controversial part. The controversial part is it can happen with any groups. In other
Yes.
words, Palestinians mistreated or put down or isolated is also a form of what I consider to be fascism. Okay. Here is the
Sure.
real question, though. I would like your opinion of, and this takes off from your
Sure.
statement, of how you view things right now in this country.
Sure.
In other words, what's your opinion of what's going on now? What level of resistance should be expected? I mean, where do you see it right now as it exists?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that it's clear that the alt-right and white supremacist politics have had a very disproportionate effect on the public debates around affirmative action, around immigration, around xenophobic issues. Polls have shown that a significant number of Americans believe white Christians to be the most persecuted demographic in the country, which is absurd. We can clearly see the influence of these politics on the Trump administration, on his policies and his communication. And so certainly when we think of the deportation of the undocumented, we can see that this is a life or death conversation that we're having, not only in the immediate sense of fascists killing people, but also in terms of what the state does when it implements fascistic policies and modes of action. Now, I think that sometimes the conversation gets bogged down in whether or not a government will come to power that calls itself fascist, which I don't think will happen. In large part, well, I don't even get into why. But what I think is like really wise about the anti-fascist perspective is we can disagree about just what we think will happen, but be prepared for the worst and be prepared for organizing against groups that are trying to create the worst. And in that sense, see that fascism isn't an all or nothing proposition, that even when small is dangerous. And also, you know, we can see that anti-fascism more broadly construed, beyond simply targeting these far-right groups, can be a way of analyzing, building social movements more broadly in the context where some people who are sympathetic to these appeals of xenophobia are under the mistaken premise that, for example, like undocumented people are stealing their jobs and so forth. And so in that sense, organizing in the labor movement, organizing immigrants can be seen as another form of anti-fascism. So I'm reluctant to sort of make straightforward historical parallels to say that this era is like that era. But when Holocaust survivors talk about how eerily familiar things feel, I think we should take that seriously as well. So, yes.
All right. So, in any of the research that went into this, has any other anti-fascist movement, other country, other era, whatever, had to deal with the peculiar situation that we have today, where there is a general public that is so profoundly ignorant about ideologies, and that thus this, well, it affects the masses, as it were, such as how let's see, Antifa keep getting called the real fascists, where people seem to
white power talking
Oh,
point.
of course, yeah. But outside of those circles,
Yeah.
people seem to think that fascism is actually left wing because they supported big government, and the Nazis had socialist in their names. And last, Antifa keep getting called liberals when it's liberals who are calling the cops on us, or defend the Nazis, like this fellow pointed out.
Right.
So has this any precedent?
Sure. Misinformation about what anti-fascism is about is not uncommon. You can look at some of the newspaper coverage of resistance to the historical fascisms of the 20s and 30s and see that newspapers have, at times, in mainstream newspapers, been critical of those who are impeding the free speech of the fascists, those who have been physically confrontational with a legitimate political party. So those elements as well. The kind of argument to say that fascism and Nazism are really in left-wing ideologies is baseless and silly. I don't know how far that effort goes. I'd be curious to track that historically. When did the right try to paint it that way? I'm not really sure. And the notion that anti-fascists are liberals is, I'm sure there are a couple, but I'm sure there are, but really it is a politics that is essentially about, in a certain sense, challenging the sovereignty of the state. It challenges the notion that the state and its police force can be trusted to stop fascism. It is a revolutionary perspective. It is a pan-socialist perspective. And so, the notion that Nancy Pelosi had to issue a statement saying that she is not an Antifa is humorous, but is totally unnecessary. But we can also see the inverse of it is that a lot of the attacks from the right on anti-fascists are attempts to lump in the Democrats with anti-fascists. But if there's anyone who's deciding whether to vote for the Democrats based on that, I don't think there really is anyone like that. So misinformation has gone back in different forms in different times and places. The notion of free speech, especially in the Anglo-American world, has been a conversation for a while. The specific thing about Nazis being leftists, I'm not sure where that comes from. Yes.
Got a lot of cameras here.
Yeah, sorry.
I understand, but it's unnerving.
Yeah, sorry.
So, based on the research you did, and I know it was in a limited amount of time, most of the people you spoke with were either European or North American.
All of them.
All the
people.
people.
I limited my focus to that just because of time and research constraints, recognizing that it's a global struggle, et cetera. Right.
Right, and I think because of social media, this is the first time we see a really pan-Western anti-fascist movement. Because of social media,
It certainly helps. Yeah.
We have people in. There are people in Greece and in Italy among. Much larger and certainly more violent protests and demonstrations. We talk about violence in America, a couple people getting punched in the face, people breaking windows, and these people are throwing Molotov cocktails at police officers. So what do you think the implication of this sort of pan-Western, this coordination, when you have anti-fascists in Europe doing banner drops and incorporating the martyrs, as they call them, of people in America in their movements, and also, what do you think? I know that you talked. I saw a clip of you talking about the difference between the opinions of free speech and how Greeks were like, bah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are other differences that not necessarily will divide them, because obviously it is a united group just against fascism, but things that are different among their opinions?
Sure, yeah. So, first, obviously, as I'm sure you would recognize, the international bonds go beyond North America and Europe to also incorporate Latin America, the Middle East, looking at the Rojava Revolution and the anti-fascists from around the world who have journeyed there to stand up against ISIS and Assad and the Turkish state. But as far as differences, so there are differences on a lot of different things that have some sort of regional or national variant to them. One of them is freedom of speech. That's a whole other conversation. I have a whole chapter in my book about it, but I'll just say a few brief things. One is there's an assumption in the United States that the sort of classically liberal notion of freedom of speech is sort of universally recognized value, but it is very historically contextual and very much an Anglo-American focus. In some of the countries I spoke to anti-fascists where they said it wasn't really a serious consideration. In others, they were sort of in the middle. But for the most part, the point that I got out from most of them is that it's essentially a liberal paradigm of understanding the struggle against the historical enemy of fascism in terms of a liberal rights framework rather than as a struggle against an existential enemy for humanity. If you want to talk more about that, you can ask me, but I'm going to leave it there for that. Yes?
Just want to say that you are not going to love these people away. Okay?
Yes. Yeah. Wasn't planning on it.
Yeah, I know. People always throw in our faces the examples of Gandhi and King. Gandhi and King succeeded shortly after the Second World War by making people look like Nazis and embarrassing them so they had to change. You can't do that with Nazis. If you make a Nazi look like a Nazi, he says thank you, and then he clobbers you. So, I mean, nonviolent civil disobedience is something I have partaken in the past. It's something I've done. I've been with groups who do it, okay? It's a tool. It's a tool in the toolbox, but it's just the wrong tool for this.
Well, I mean, even with this, though, I think it's often the right tool. It's just not always. Right? So, I mean, most of what anti-fascists do does not even rely on that. It often relies on public opinion, on the fact that people hate Nazis. So if you out a Nazi, he's going to lose his job. He's going to lose his community. But you point to the fact that nonviolence works best when it can leverage public opinion, when it can influence a certain number of people that'll influence a state or influence a policy. Was there a demographic of opinion that could have stopped Hitler's killing machine? Today, is there a demographic of public opinion that could stop ISIS from murdering the Kurdish population of northern Syria? No, right? So there are times when self-defense is legitimate, which is not to say that it's usually the best option or the first option, but if we look at any historical struggle where the legitimacy of self-defense is obvious, I think that this would be one of them. So yes, thank you for your comment. Hi.
Hey. Sometime back, I was in one of the big marches against Trump, and people were chanting all night, all day, punch a Nazi in the face. And I'm older than I look. I'm 52. I reminded people that my father's generation did a lot more than punch Nazis. We know how bad it can get. My father fought in World War II, and he didn't do so I could have to fight Nazis too 70 years later. We know how bad it can get. Now, the question is, given the known connections between the hard alt-right through Breitbart to the Trump administration, what do you think the odds are that the extreme white supremacists who want a, quote, white ethno-state will get the civil war that they in their own tweets are screaming for?
Well, the point of anti-fascist politics is to avoid that civil war, right? So you don't wait until such a point where that breaks out. You stop it while it's small. You stop it while it's in its first steps. And so I was really struck by the quote on the back of my book, and here's where I'm going to test who has my book. No, there's a quote on the back of my book from an anti-fascist from Baltimore, and his perspective is, I think, instrumental for this conversation, which is you fight them by writing letters and making phone calls so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists so you don't have to fight them with knives, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is really useful for thinking of the fact that people are arguing, oh, these anti-fascists are trying to normalize political violence and make everything about violence, but white supremacist and fascist politics are bringing the violence and they're trying to stop it, certainly with whatever means are necessary, but if a means are not necessary, they're not necessary. And the word necessary always gets lost when people discuss that quote anyway. And so I think that's useful for thinking through the question. Yes?
As I think the gentleman who introduced you alluded to, you find yourself publishing your book at sort of a uniquely timely moment.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to your view of why that is exactly. So
Yeah.
as you suggested yourself, anti-fascist organizing in the Americas is hardly a novel phenomenon.
Right.
And yet an enormous number of people who had no idea what this movement was or what its organizing goals
Right.
were have learned about it in just really the last 90 days
Yeah.
or so.
Yeah.
Even less, I guess.
Yeah.
Post Charlottesville, post Berkeley.
Right.
I've heard a lot of kind of facile suggestions for why that is. I'd be interested in hearing your analysis of why you think this message, not even just why this message is resonating right now, but more why the mass media and has picked this up and decided that it's worth covering this angle, when maybe they didn't do that in other mass organizing instances over the last couple decades.
Right. Well, I mean, looking at the example of Anti-Racist Action, which was the sort of predecessor of this wave of anti-fascist organizing in the U.S., Canada, and Latin America, Anti-Racist Action hit its numerical peak in the 1990s when it had hundreds of branches and thousands of members and was doing not only sort of explicitly anti-fascist organizing, but organizing to defend reproductive rights and organize in solidarity with Palestine and all sorts of stuff. And in that sense, there probably at its peak there were more people doing that kind of organizing than there are today, at least in that explicit sense. But it didn't get as much attention. Maybe part of it is the fact that Bill Clinton was president for a lot of that. Today we have Donald Trump. I think Trump is the key for understanding a lot of the media interest in this, and Trump's connection to the alt-right. I think certainly had Hillary won the election, the alt-right would still be the alt-right, but the media may be less interested in that narrative. Who knows? That's just speculation. But as far as the sort of book is concerned, I wrote it in part because I attended the protests against Trump in D.C. back in January. I wrote a piece for Roar magazine about everyday anti-fascism, trying to think through how we can push back against the attempts of the alt-right to make racism great again. And one thing led to another, and a publisher was interested in writing this, in part because they saw it as topical. Why is it topical? Certainly part of it is the question of the spectacle. The media is interested in the conflict in Berkeley with Milo Yiannopoulos. If it bleeds, it leads, as far as the media is concerned, and that's part of it. And that's, of course, distorted the larger politics and history behind it. But there is sort of a larger sense, which is I don't know, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your question.
So my question really is, how much violence is too much violence, or what are the certain sort of lines that we sort of draw? You've talked a lot about your opening story is like they go up and crack some skulls, right? And then it sort of is dramatically sort of, I don't know, it becomes disruption and all that sort of stuff. So I guess what are the sort of like, what does the moral compass say at the point where you talk about more corporeal sort of like, we're going to fight or kill or, start to really brush up against some of the, I don't know, places where violence really it's the sort of violence that, people who are citizens can't really use.
Sure.
So.
Well, the perspective I got from those that I interviewed is that there's a political goal to be accomplished, which is to stop this organizing, and there is a whole toolbox of options to do that. One of the options is what you're referring to, and the argument that I got from the people I interviewed is that it's used selectively and when necessary, and in terms of proportion is ideally proportional. Now, of course, I'm not going to say that in all of the history of 100 years of anti-fascism around the world that everyone would subscribe to that, but that was the dominant perspective of what I got from the people that I interviewed. And so the other way to look at it is to sort of start backwards in history and say, okay, there came a time when armed resistance to the Nazis and the fascists was legitimate. Most people would agree with that. The question is, how bad does it have to get before that becomes legitimate? How can we stop things before we even have to have the question about arms? How can we stop it before it even gets to the point where these people can find anyone who agrees with them to go out and organize a march? So the perspective I got, and once again, I want to reiterate that my attempt here is to present the opinions of those that I interviewed, is that it depends on the context. And most politics is really about context. Anti-fascism is certainly about context. And most waves of anti-fascist organizing grow out of a perceived threat. So in the 70s and 80s, when there were neo-Nazi skinhead groups targeting, in the case of Britain, migrants from Caribbean and South Asia, or in Turkey when there were attacks on Turkish communities and refugee centers, then these groups started and they found a need to confront these boneheads in the street. But, it's all contextual. So I think the anti-fascist argument is you try to do it as easily as possible and as effectively as possible, doing what's necessary. But if it's not necessary, then it's not necessary.
We can take the next 4 questions.
So with all the people you've talked to and information you've gathered, what's the most interesting thing for you that you've learned?
You know, a lot of the things that were really interesting at first, I've talked about them now so much that I'm even getting a little stale for me now. What is interesting? Well, all right, this is what comes to mind. When we think of anti-fascism, there's this focus on conflict. But from interviewing some of the anti-fascists that I spoke to in Greece, there are these exciting social centers where anti-fascists are working with refugees from the Syrian civil war to expand what anti-fascism can look like. So there's one social center in Thessaloniki where Syrians who were bakers back home set up a cooperative bakery in the anti-fascist social center. And then there's another group of Syrians and I think Iraqis who were barbers and have a collective barbershop in the anti-fascist social center. And in that sense, a lot of bonds have been built between these different communities. Some of them also participate in the anti-fascist kickboxing collective they have there and have over time been integrated into the struggle against Golden Dawn, both because of their own persecution and because of the solidarity built through these kinds of initiatives. So I think that those are the kind of stories that would be useful to have out there in addition to think more broadly about what anti-fascism can mean, resistance can mean, who has a skin in the game when it comes to fighting back against these monsters. So that's what comes to mind.
Thank you.
Sure.
Following up on the person
Sure.
ahead of her, I guess I first heard about this movement in the inauguration.
Sure.
And that didn't seem to me to be self-defense. That seemed to me to be an aggressive action, or at least this is the way I thought it would happen, an aggressive action against innocent people.
Now, what are we specifically talking about here? I just want to make sure I'm
not quite
clear.
sure.
Okay.
But there were some
Property destruction? Is that what we're referring to? Okay, just want to make sure I'm understanding. So, yes, the anti-capitalist, anti-fascist march on Inauguration Day that happened in this city was an anti-fascist initiative, among other things. Now, the question of sort of anti-fascism as self-defense, let's take a step back and realize that a lot of liberal pundits were literally saying we have a fascist who's being elected here, right? Now, the question I would ask is do we think that Trump is a fascist or fascistic or authoritarian figure or not? Let's just assume for the sake of argument that we think he is. What does that mean our politics should look like, right? Does it mean that we should go about business as usual, hold signs, make little memes, or does it mean that we should grind the country to a halt and say, this racist person running our country is a huge threat, that people will lose their lives by being deported, by being deprived of health care, by being incarcerated, by being killed by police, and make it so that we will not accept business as usual. That was the stated rationale for the organizers of that march, which was essentially, to the degree that they could, business as usual will not proceed if we bring a fascist or an authoritarian or fill-in-the-blank racist, awful human being to run this country in a way that will necessarily cost lives. Maybe breaking shit is a way to make that clear. That was the rationale for the people who engaged in property destruction at the march. Whether or not people find that to be a convincing rationale all has to do with your assessment of the situation in your politics. But that's where the perspective was coming from, and in that sense, I think is in line with an anti-fascist perspective, which is you assume that when people say that they want to organize some sort of authoritarian racist society, that they mean it. So that's my best effort to explain, as I understand, the rationale of the organizers of that march.
Hi there.
Hello.
You said that you were protesting on Inauguration Day
Yes,
in
I
D.C.
was. Mm-hmm.
So you probably have heard about the kettle that happened and the Disrupt J20
yes.
defendants. So as you pointed out earlier, anti-fascism sort of writ large is challenging the sovereignty of the state, and that anti-fascist activists do not trust that police, and I would add the media and other large sort of pillars of our society to do the work of anti-fascism. So my question is, given the context that we have, I would say definitely fascistic administration, and while we're trying to disrupt that anti-fascism, we're also facing state repression.
Indeed.
So what have you learned? Are there any lessons from the history and the interviews about how to continue to do that organizing while also trying to defend from 80 years or more of jail time?
And while we're on that topic, let's take a moment to encourage people to visit defendj20.org, I believe it is.
Yes.
DefendJ20resistance.org.
Yeah, please.
DefendJ20resistance.org.
Could you give an extended plug if you're up for it?
Sure. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. My name's Sam. I'm a member of the DC Legal Posse, which is a group of folks in DC working on the folks who are facing 75 years in prison for being in the geographic vicinity of a few acts of property destruction on Inauguration Day. You can go to defendj20resistance.org for more information. You can also go to dclegalposse.org/donate to provide some money for folks coming back and forth to DC. It's been huge. There's a good passage about it in Mark's book, and he talks a lot about other folks who are facing state repression as a result of anti-fascist action.
Right, and so thinking through the fact that when you have the fascist creep and the growth of authoritarianism in a society, you have to always think of this sort of canary in a coal mine situation when, all right, who are the first people that will be not important enough for society to care about? In this case, it was people who are accused of breaking windows or accused of being in the vicinity of broken windows. And so if we're serious about fighting back against state repression and fascism, even if you disagree with the people who broke windows, protecting these people and standing up for them is incumbent upon preventing this from spreading and spreading and spreading and spreading even farther. So I couldn't encourage people to support that more. Now, as far as the question of repression and anti-fascism historically, anti-fascism is all about dealing with repression because fascism is repression, either in an official state capacity or a paramilitary capacity or a street capacity, and is an effort to stop the advance of social justice movements, of the labor movement. It's an it's an effort to try and keep demographics of society who have fought for liberation from being able to do that. So in that sense, you know, it's sort of as integral to the conversation as it is to any other kind of struggle. I'm not sure specifically more what to say, but so much as to say that in that sense, we can think of jail solidarity as an anti-fascist action, even if it's not for people who are arrested for doing explicitly anti-fascist work. And this is where we sort of hit the point where anti-fascism can be understood beyond the label to be building a world free from oppressive institutions like prisons, getting rid of police who are clearly putting people in prison. Honestly, I don't have anything really super to say except let's get rid of police. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks. You have a question too? All right,
I do, yeah.
Great.
So I have one final question. You do a really good job in your book of situating this in American context where the KKK is sort of the most significant proto-fascist progenitor of the fascist movements in Europe. So, I mean, when we're thinking about this in the United States, people often will talk about punching Nazis, but they don't talk about punching the KKK, right? People will think about concentration camps, but they won't think about the Red Summer of 1919, or they won't think about Reconstruction. How do we shift the conversation to make it more about, you know, the Black Panthers as anti-fascists?
Sounds great.
And more about anti-racism, and less about just the sort of dilettantes like Richard Spencer.
Yeah, and you're right that there's been a tendency for World War II and the Holocaust to take over the entire conversation, which is unfortunate, especially since, as I mentioned at the outset, the struggle against white supremacy in the Americas goes back so much farther and includes so much more. And an American anti-fascism used not in a nationalist sense, but in describing the Americas, should have that at the forefront of what it's about in a decolonial sense, right? How to do that is, I guess, to just keep saying that. Right? I mean, that's part of it. And also to realize that there are people doing this work who may or may not identify as anti-fascist, but that doesn't really matter, right? And that, so in that sense, we can think of it more broadly. The purpose of my book was to focus on people who self-identified as anti-fascist, in part because I try to be wary of imposing labels on people. But the label isn't all that important. The label is a means to understanding a certain politics. And building bridges between different kind of struggles is, of course, a recipe for making sure that these different perspectives cross-pollinate. And at the end of the day, the conversation is about white supremacy, is about genocide in all of its forms, and the Holocaust and World War II and Nazis are part of that, but only one part of it. So, thanks, and that's
actually,
it, right?
Actually, we do have time for one more question.
Okay,
if
one
that
more.
is okay.
Okay,
Thank
all
you
right.
so.
Well, I'm not the boss here, so, but if you maybe you
can both ask the
maybe if
questions
you
together.
yeah, ask them
that would be
together
great.
and try to be
Thank
brief.
you so much.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you think the Antifa folks have it enough together to realize it's important not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean.
And what's the baby?
Well, the baby is that we have had a stable democracy for a long time,
Oh, okay.
which has had huge problems, yes, but somehow we've gotten women to vote. We got rid of, Jim Crow, and, it took a horrendously long time to do all these things. But as a liberal and a Democrat and a Christian and somebody who was just talked to in church by one of those ministers who were linking arms there in Charlottesville and got rescued by the Antifa, I'm certainly not against them.
Understood.
But I hope they don't shoot themselves in the foot by going too far with this thing that sounds too much like just anarchists. I do not want to live, I'm sorry, in D.C. with absolutely no police force. I do want to see people attacking the bad training some police get. And I just felt like, I wondered if you've heard that kind of conversation very often among the Antifa folks themselves.
No, but
Okay,
I
have to be a little again.
No. You raise important points, but if we could do both questions together, and then I can sort of,
Very quickly, in your book, which I'm going to buy.
Okay, thanks.
Do you make reference to, speaking of fascism, the Anglo-American program of? I'm having a senior moment here.
Take your time.
Begins with a G. No. Post-World War II, Gladio. Are you familiar with that program?
Not sure.
I encourage every single person before they have their last breath.
Okay.
And I'm being very sincere about this because it ties in to what's playing out.
Okay.
Donald Trump is just the sideshow. He's a symptom to a bigger problem. So it's called Gladio. You can get it, YouTube, put it in Gladio, and there was a BBC doc. But the other thing, back to, not that I am in complete agreement, but to carry on, the baby with the bathwater, one extreme tries to cross out another, is if you're dealing with American culture, and you've only interviewed the folks here, right? One, I'm a little
no.
And there.
Here, there,
and having lived both sides of the Atlantic, the cultural differences, and we don't have how quickly we've rolled back rights. The fascist of this society, which is founded, woke up one day and said, what the heck has happened? Democracy in this republic has kind of taken over. And so I'm thinking on a policy, how can this group really make inroads and having to be careful how they present their position and waking up the complacent masses or desperate? How are they really going to do it when you're dealing with a society that has really, really struggled with true democracy and true being out of the ideology of all that matters in the human condition and society is material economics?
All right. So between the two of those, there's quite a bit to address. I'm going to pick and choose a couple of points and move on. One is that people who are happy with liberal democracy should still fight fascism, right? So let's all walk out with that to take away at least. Second, police abolition is not just get rid of the police and cross your fingers. It has everything to do with building a new society where the reasons why the police exist are transformed. So that. So for people that are curious about that, there's a lot written on that, and that by people who could say that better than I could. As far as
remembering how the Hunger Games ended.
As far as the revolutionary aspirations of anti-fascism, they argue that you can see the roots of fascism in capitalism in the state, and so therefore, if you want to root them out, you need to do a broader social transformation. But really, like we're into a sort of second presentation worth of content here. So I appreciate the questions, and you all coming out, and have a great night. Thanks.